Joined now by Ian Bremmer. He's president of the Eurasia Group. Mr. Bremmer, welcome, sir.
Chuck, good to be with you.
I got a little bit of breaking news here from our friends across the pond at The Sun. They claim this world exclusive, and I want to get you to quickly react to it. This is from the Sun's political editor. Donald Trump warns Theresa May that her soft Brexit blueprint will kill any future trade deal with the United States. And then they have this quote from an interview with the president. So he did an interview with The Sun, and he says this: if they do a deal like that, we would be dealing with the European Union instead of dealing with the UK. So it will probably kill the deal. President Trump inserting himself into Theresa May's domestic politics. Ian.
Trump also said that he had told Prime Minister May how he would have done Brexit and that she didn't listen to him. So what do you do? Look, there's lots of reasons why the UK is not going to get a separate trade deal with the United States. First of all, incredibly difficult to negotiate a new deal with this administration on trade. Ask the Canadians, ask the Mexicans, ask the Japanese why they're so reluctant. Secondly, the Brits actually do not have the people even to negotiate their Brexit deal. The trade professionals, they're trying as hard as possible to actually hire and train those people now. We are many years away from their ability to start negotiating new deals. And now Trump said he wouldn't negotiate it if they moved forward with the May deal. So there are so many reasons why this deal is not going to happen. But certainly it's rubbing a little salt into an extremely wounded UK prime minister who's had an absolutely abysmal week.
I was just going to say, how is this not the end? Did he just, I mean, whatever you think of President Trump, if you're in Parliament and you're a member of Theresa May's party, the Conservative Party, you say to yourself, the special relationship's done if we do this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no question that there's no special relationship right now between the U.S. and the UK, though Trump is clearly much more unhappy with the Germans broadly on defense, on trade, on energy, and with Merkel specifically as a leader than he is with the UK or with Prime Minister May. And also keep in mind, nobody in the Conservative Party wants this job right now. Right. It's a poison chalice, right? So, I mean, if she were to have a vote of confidence in the Conservative Party right now, she would actually win it.
She'd survive simply because you don't want to do it in the middle of this? That would be the argument?
Yep.
Don't change horses in midstream. Yep. All right, let me ask you about fallout from NATO. I know behind the scenes there are a lot of official U.S. channels trying to calm allies down. What have you heard?
The meeting was hijacked by President Trump. When he's in the room, he only wants to talk about the issues that he wants to talk about, wasn't using his advisors, didn't come armed with a lot of accurate facts, pressed the Germans most hard, but pressed everybody. And the final conversation that he said came to absolutely no specific agreement from any government that was in attendance, though there was a desire on the part of American NATO allies to say, we're working on this. I mean, kind of sort of calm him down without offering anything. The good news is while they didn't offer anything, Trump didn't threaten anything, right? I mean, certainly Trump's style of dealing with NATO is a little different from Obama's. I think we can say that safely. But in terms of actually threatening to leave NATO, to not adhere to Article 5, which says that there'd be collective security, the American would defend their allies, to maybe pull out U.S. troops in Germany, at no point in the meetings did he threaten any of the allies that he was going to do any of that at any particular time. And absolutely, allies were worried that he might do that.
So, Ian, it strikes me that everything Trump's done with this NATO meeting was done for public consumption, less for private consumption. So that takes us to Vladimir Putin and that one-on-one. How else do you explain the president's public NATO behavior if it doesn't involve Vladimir Putin?
Well, I do think one of the reasons why Trump might not be giving any ultimatums to NATO is because this meeting is happening right before Putin. And so he wants to show, yeah, I'm on board with the alliance. I'm pushing the Germans and others to spend more. I'm criticizing them on this pipeline that goes directly to Russia, which he is, by the way, absolutely right to criticize the Germans on. But He, at the end of the meeting, then undercut himself by saying, well, maybe if we have a better relationship with Russia, that pipeline won't be so much of an issue. He is clearly setting himself up to have a fantastic meeting with Putin. And when he said at the beginning of the trip, right before he left, that maybe the best meeting would be with Putin, that's true. I mean, you know,
what does that
Theresa May
mean?
doesn't want him there. The NATO allies don't want him there. But Putin actually is looking forward to seeing him in Helsinki.
There's no doubt. And Putin seems to have an agenda.
Yeah.
And I think the question is, he has something he wants to get out of this, a couple things he wants to get out of this. We don't know what the president wants out of this. What can you tell us? What does Putin want out of this summit?
Well, I mean, the fact that he's meeting with Bibi Netanyahu, I'd be very interested to see if Netanyahu has a conversation with Trump right before Trump meets with Putin. That would be an interesting last message to be delivered from Putin as to what he really wants in this meeting that I think would be trusted by Trump. So that's interesting to watch.
That's having to do with Syria and Iran specifically.
It certainly
Yes.
could be on Israel-Palestine, could be on arms. I mean, it's a useful channel to deliver any message from Putin to Trump. But secondarily, we know that Trump wants to remove U.S. troops from Syria against the strong advice from Secretary Mattis. Putin would be delighted with that. We know that Trump has privately told the allies that Ukraine is corrupt. He never says that about Russia. He'd like to come to some sort of terms of saying Crimea was bygones be bygones. I could easily imagine him saying something that feels like formal recognition. Let's put sanctions behind us. Let's be more constructive. So it's very clear Trump wants to get on a much better footing with Putin, and yet the Trump administration's policies towards Russia are actually, in their substance, much harder line than the Obama administration's were in terms of sanctions, in terms of providing weapons for Ukraine. I mean, on a whole host, in terms of throwing diplomats out. And we can't ignore that because, you know, Trump is president. He could have stopped those policies from happening.
It's the most fascinating conundrum that we deal with in this part of the administration speaks with one voice on Russia, except for President Trump.
Except for President Trump. And even people that have left the Trump administration at high levels have said to me privately, we can't understand what's driving him on Russia.
Well, there's plenty of people that have versions of the answers of what they think the answer is. But Ian Bremmer, we will leave it there. Thank you, sir. This is right in your wheelhouse, man. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.